All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Imagine a historical figure whose life so brilliantly blurs the line between a ruthless conqueror and a pious legend that history actually struggles to define him. Born in 1118, Sultan Nur Uddin Zengi inherited a totally fractured realm and managed to transform it into this unified, unstoppable powerhouse. But what makes him so genuinely captivating isn't just his military record. It's the incredible dual nature of his legacy. We're going to dive into how traditional, cultural narratives and historical chronicles both paint a picture of a man who was just as devoted to justice and faith as he was to expanding his vast empire.
So, we really have to ask ourselves, how does one man strike absolute terror into the hearts of crusaders, yet simultaneously refuse to take more than 20 dinars a year from his own treasury? I mean, it's a stunning contradiction, right? On one hand, you have an unstoppable military strategist, and on the other, a man who viewed himself merely as a public servant. To truly grasp the cultural impact Nur al-Din had on his world, we need to look at the stories that defined him.
Let's start with what is arguably the most famous story about him, the dream and the legend of his frantic race to Medina. Now, according to traditional sources, we get this story of just sheer, undeniable devotion. The account goes that after praying late at night, Nur al-Din was visited in his sleep by the Prophet Muhammad. And this wasn't just a fleeting dream. It happened 3 separate times. In the vision, the Prophet pointed to 2 terrifying men, asking for protection from them. So, springing straight out of bed, Nur al-Din grabbed his 20 closest guards and rode frantically for Medina. Once he got there, to catch the culprits, he cleverly threw this massive citywide feast so he could personally inspect every single face in the city. When he finally spotted the 2 men from his dream, who were posing as devout pilgrims, by the way, he uncovered a secret tunnel hidden right under their mat. They were spies, digging day and night to steal the prophet's body. And to really put into perspective just how frantic this rescue mission was, a grueling desert journey from Damascus to Medina normally took about 25 days. But driven by his vision, Nur al-Din and his men practically flew across the desert, covering the entire distance in a blistering 16 days. It's this legendary sprint that really cemented his status as the divine protector of the faith. Moving on to the geopolitical reality, let's look at his process of unifying the Sultanate, expanding all the way from Aleppo down to Egypt. When you actually track his expansion, you see this incredibly methodical genius, achieving his ultimate dream, uniting the Muslim forces between the Euphrates and the Nile. He inherited Aleppo in 1146. Then, by 1154, he remarkably annexes Damascus, and he does it with the help of the city's own population. But he knew that Egypt was the real key to surrounding his enemies. Fast forward to 1171, and under his strict orders, the Fatimid Caliphate is abolished by a commander you've probably heard of, Saladin, bringing Egypt firmly under Nur al-Din's control.
Of course, you can't talk about his reign without getting into his relentless battles against the Crusaders and how he defended the realm, because unifying those vast lands meant systematically neutralizing some massive threats. During the Second Crusade in 1148, the combined French and German siege of Damascus completely collapsed in just 4 days. Why? Simply because of the looming terror of Nur al-Din's approaching armies. A year later, he completely destroyed the Crusader army at the Battle of Imad. And by the 1160s, it turned into this high-stakes chess match over Egypt where he consistently outmaneuvered King Amalek I, effectively driving the Crusaders out and gaining absolute control.
Now, here's where the history gets really fascinating. Even his sworn enemies had to tip their hats to him. The prominent Crusader historian William of Tyre obviously viewed Nur al-Din as a mighty persecutor of his faith. Yet, he recorded him in history as a just prince and a religious man. I mean, to earn that level of respect from the very people you were actively fighting on the battlefield, that is exceptionally rare.
Which brings us perfectly to his reputation as a just and pious ruler, famously known as the humble treasurer.
You have to wonder, how does a guy controlling this unimaginably wealthy empire handle his own personal finances? Well, there's this great story where his wife actually complained that they were practically living in poverty. His response was legendary. He flat out refused to dip into state funds for his own comfort, telling her, "What you see with me is the trust of the Muslims. I am merely their treasurer." He wasn't willing to betray that trust, not even for his own family's luxury. So instead of lining his own pockets, he enriched his society's mind. 42. That is the number of madrasas or educational institutions built across Syria during his reign, and he personally sponsored half of them himself, just to ensure a lasting legacy of knowledgeable scholars and judges. He went
Far beyond just building stone monuments too, he literally institutionalized absolute justice. Think about this level of accountability for a second. Nur al-Din held public courts every single week where any commoner could just walk in, file a grievance against his top generals, and the Sultan himself would hear it. He built free hospitals for the poor, safe rest houses for travelers and pilgrims, and notably, he granted tolerance and peace to Christians living within Damascus under his authority. And honestly, nothing highlights his forward-looking faith quite like the story of the minbar, or pulpit. Nur al-Din commissioned this breathtaking wooden pulpit specifically for the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The catch? He didn't even control Jerusalem yet. He carried it with him as a symbol of his ultimate, unwavering goal. Even though he didn't live to see it happen, his successor, Saladin, eventually captured Jerusalem and fulfilled Nur al-Din's dream, carrying that exact same pulpit into the mosque with his own hands. Finally, let's look at his final years and his legacy, because we actually have two very different accounts of his end. When you look at his final days in May of 1174, history and legend completely diverge. Traditional cultural accounts elevate his death to this dramatic martyrdom, claiming the infamous assassins infiltrated his camp and poisoned him because they were so terrified of his spirit. However, the historical and medical chronicles record a much more grounded, frankly, ordinary reality. He died at age 56 from a severe fever, brought on by a throat abscess, right as he was preparing to march on Egypt. So, having seen the vast maps of his conquered territories, and having heard these incredible legendary tales of his absolute modesty as the people's treasurer, it leaves us with a pretty compelling question. What truly cements a leader's place in history? Is it the massive lands they conquer with the sword, or the enduring legends of justice they leave behind? Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this explainer of Sultan Nur Uddin Zengi's remarkably complex legacy.